Good morning from Tokyo, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Today is the first day of HENNGE Talks, and welcome to all audience from all over the world. My name is Jazman Barizi. You can call me Jazz, and I'm digital marketing specialist at HENNGE, and I will be your host for the first session of HENNGE Talks. And what is HENNGE Talks, you ask? HENNGE Talks is the webinar for motivated software engineers and also UI UX designers interested in a scoop on how tech leaders are shaping the future in Japan. So today we will have 3 sessions that we will go through together. So I would like the tech team to pull up the timetable for the first day. So the first session will be single sign-on, endless possibilities, which starting from now until 1 p.m. JST. The second session of the day would be next-gen company culture, starting from 2 p.m. until 3 p.m. JST. And the last session of the day would be get more out of your next tech conference, starting from 4 p.m. until 5 p.m. JST. And if we can go to the next slide, the day 2 of HENNGE Talks, we have behind the screens UI UX design for impact as the first session of the day. And the second session would be front end only, maintaining cloud stores from the front end only, starting from 2 p.m. until 3 p.m. JST. And the last session of HENNGE Talks would be Enter the New World of Work, starting from 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. And for today's session, let's go to the next slide. We have single sign-on, endless possibilities. Get to know SSO with Jon Gaul. What you're gonna learn today is gonna be the ultimate guide to SSO, or single sign-on. The second one will be the foundational understanding of SSO itself. The third one, real-world product knowledge. And last thing, is SSO for you or not? We're gonna get through all of it together. And just in case you have any questions, you can drop it in the Q&A box below. I think it's under somewhere below the screen. So feel free to open the box and type in your questions. At the end of the session, we will go through all of them. And if there are like so many questions, then we will pick the question that will be answered together with Jon. So today, I have my colleague here, which will be the speaker of the very first session, which is Jon Gaul, and I'm gonna give it to him. Jon Gaul, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jazz. As he mentioned, we'll be talking about the basics of single sign-on. And whether it's right for you, I hate to spoil the talk, but I think the answer might be yes. So, welcome to the first HENNGE Talks talk. I'm so thrilled to bring it to you. This is single sign-on, endless possibilities. I am Jon, as Jazz mentioned. I grew up in North Dakota in the US, went to school in Georgia, graduated from Georgia Tech, and now I get to work in Tokyo, Japan. I'm a software engineer here at HENNGE, working on the back end of our single sign-on flagship product. And I have a love for cryptography. I think that the mathematics behind it are really beautiful. And they do play a role here. But ultimately, the cool thing about single sign-on is how it helps you manage the human element that interacts with it. So what is this talk even about? In a word, it's about how single sign-on is cool. We're going to talk a bit about the problems in general with access control. We're going to talk about how single sign-on solves these problems directly rather than mitigates them. Why you should want to integrate SSO into whatever kind of application you're working on. And we're going to do a deep dive into the actual tech, but don't worry, there's enough pictures. We'll go slow and take it together. So real quick, you might be thinking, single sign-on. It's simple, right? You use one login on many websites. Whenever you need to make a new account, you just use your same email, same password, and that is not what it is at all. You should not be using the same password everywhere. That is password reuse. If you're doing it at home, you're setting it up so that the weakest website that you log into winds up being the weak link that exposes all of your personal data across the web. And if you do it at work, you're going to make your IT professionals very unhappy. But it's hard to be too mad at it. There's something very human about that desire. See, if security is inconvenient, people just ignore that security. Your company can use cutting-edge algorithms to make sure that it's almost uncrackable. But given the chance, people will just reuse the same passwords. Or maybe you're going to get clever about it, force people to cycle their passwords out, once a week, once a month, or make them arbitrarily complicated. In that case, people generally just write the passwords down that they need, where they need them, usually stuck to the monitor. Or they cycle through password 01, password 02, password 03. People find the solution for the problem they're facing. The cool thing about single sign-on is it allows for that level of convenience without any of the security risk. In the business-to-consumer space, you'll find that single sign-on will let you reduce friction across the development cycle, offloading development work to larger specialist companies, all while making an easier, safer, simpler experience for your customers. And in the business-to-business space, you're accessing a huge market with deep pockets. And frankly, single sign-on is a requirement for these groups. Plus, you're showing a security guarantee that can really make your product stand out. But at this point, you might be thinking, I've heard about password managers. They sound like they solve this problem. And on the consumer level, you're absolutely right. The ability to automatically make and remember passwords is something that computers are really good at. For example, Bitwarden is free. It's open source for all of the open source nerds in this talk. If you aren't using one, I highly recommend it or any of the premium alternatives. But there are a few problems, especially at scale with using password managers. So if you are a company with a few hundred employees, all rigorously generating new and unique passwords, in a breach of one of these systems, how do you rotate all of these passwords? One at a time, manually? Perhaps there's compliance issues you have to address. Where are the passwords physically stored? Where are those servers? Sure, you offer tools to randomly generate passwords, but can we guarantee that the individual users are making those passwords up to code? And of course, arguably one of the biggest risks of these is that convenient browser add-on that lets you automatically populate login forms with the passwords. That is an application that has to be downloaded, and so it can get out of date. How can you guarantee that all of your employees are using the most up-to-date, safest version? Single sign-on directly solves these concerns rather than just mitigates them. When connected services to a single sign-on product don't need to know your password, that is less sensitive information that gets transferred. Our suite of products allows for various integrations as well to make things more secure on top of that. Additionally, strong admin controls at the identity provider level let you enforce standards for your entire company in one place. Make sure that all your users are using up-to-date passwords, cycle them in an emergency, but only cycle the one. And of course, on the user side, when everything's handled via a web dashboard, you don't have to worry about updates. And as a user, you just click the service that you want to log into, and all of the security happens automatically on the back end. And it sounds pretty good, and I definitely want to talk more about single sign-on, but to make sure that we're all on the same page, I want to deliver a quick login review for some of you, and overview if you are a little bit less familiar with networking. So, imagine I'm John, and I'd like to log into a website. I send over my username and my password, and the website checks its database, sees whether it has the same username and password stored, ideally hashed, salted, but we're not going to get into that quite right now. And once it determines that the username and password match, it'll send back a token to me. And then I'll store that token, which says that I am the user John, and whenever I want to do something that only I can do, I'll send along that token. The website can go in, verify it's from me, and then if I want to do something that only I can do, perform the action. We call that a bearer token because what's important is, well, that I'm bearing the token. And before we get any further, I would like to briefly talk about that token itself. If you're not familiar with networking, this part can seem a little bit like a black box, and I want to just go in a little bit and talk there. We want a token that is descriptive enough to tell us things like user info, maybe a link to a profile picture, maybe a time when the account was created, We want the token to expire at some point, so you can't just get this token once, log in, and then no longer worry about authentication. And probably the most importantly, we want something that the user can't just edit and send back and fool the website into thinking they're someone they aren't. JSON Web Tokens are a very popular option for this, but keep in mind, they're one of many. Certainly you can use this through other methods, but these show up in certain SSO contexts, so having this background information will help you out. And just looking at this wall of text, it is a little bit scary. But if you break it down, it's actually quite straightforward. JWTs consist of a header, a body, and a signature. That header is very rudimentary information. The algorithm used to encode the signature at the end, and a type that shows that it is a JWT. You might have other information in here, things like a key ID if that factors into your security. The body, though, is generally what people are interested in. It's things like the audience, the site that expects to use the JWT. User data, like the username, profile picture, and that expiration date so that we can verify it. And all of this is encoded in base 64, which, if you don't know, is very easy to change back and forth. There's nothing stopping you from putting this into an editor and directly changing the name, the expiration date, anything about it, which is where the signature comes in. It is that data quite literally encrypted with a secret. And that secret can verify that the header and the body haven't been changed by the user. There's two ways, generally, to process encryption. One is called symmetric. You use the same key to turn any piece of data into something that can't be edited to show that original data. And then you take that seemingly nonsense string and take that same private key, that secret, and you decrypt it back into the original text. Meanwhile, asymmetric encryption uses two different keys. You keep one secret that you use to generate that signature, but then you publish the public key, and anyone with access to it can look at the JWT and confirm it is what it says it is. The first has the advantage that you control all the information. If you're sending over a secret, you want symmetric encryption. But if you just want to make a signature that anyone can verify, asymmetric encryption is what people tend to use. And as this is, it's pretty tough to find a weak point in it. As a malicious actor, you're going to have difficulty snooping on the messages back and forth if you're using HTTPS with proper certificates. Like I said, that strong token means you can't falsify it. Doing things like same-site cookies, sanitized inputs mean that on the user side, things are generally safe. And if you keep up to date on the latest security practices, the website itself should also be secure. And when these are well implemented, these are perfectly safe logins. You're not going to get any security benefits inherently just by switching to SSO. The problem is that this only applies if they're well implemented. And for enough websites, you're guaranteeing that at least one will have an outdated package of software or something implemented incorrectly. And that's a bit unsatisfying, because you're expecting that every individual person is keeping their website secure. And also, it's less a problem inherent to the system, but it's a little bit inefficient. Every website owner has to repeat the same work to get the same result, when all that's important is that the end user has the token that says who they are. Ultimately, these low-trust systems are inherently inefficient because everyone has to verify things for themselves. We can add a trusted authenticator and result in a better user experience without compromising security. And now we get to talk about single sign-on. For the business-to-consumer devs, you're looking at social logins as the easiest entry point. And you might be saying, well, look, we have our two-party login flow. It's safe enough. We're up to date on our security. Is this even a big deal? I've spent a lot of time harping on security. But in e-commerce, there's a completely different reason to implement these social logins. I cannot be the only person who's done some online shopping, gone to the shopping cart, saw that I needed to create an account, and just decided not to check out. If your livelihood or your application's livelihood depends on people making that final step, single sign-on will increase your the ultimate percentage of people who go through with those sales. And thankfully, we've all seen social logins. They're the button that says connect with Facebook, log in with Google. They redirect you to a page that lets you select your account and has the little very satisfying progress bar saying that you're logging back in. And they're popular. It's very anecdotal data, tough to track down actual numbers. But among young people, they're preferred by about 50% of the people who log in. And granted, there's some big error bars, but it's between 30 and 70. We're not talking a negligible percentage of your users. And if you're spinning up an application for the first time, hacking something together, you might consider prioritizing social logins before working on your own custom login system to capture a bigger percentage of the market and spend dev hours where they really matter. They're also a simpler user experience. In the e-commerce example, if I have to make my own account, I have to type in my email, I have to type in a password. I have to save that password in my password manager because I can't remember it. I might have to go and verify my email, come back, set up the account. In social logins, I click, yes, I'd like to log in. Yes, I'd like to log into this site. And depending on what kind of site it is and how they've set it up, it might even have populated a lot of my user info already. It's also easier for you as a developer. You're letting another specialist company handle user setup, handle password storage, password resets, two-factor authentication, consent management, and dealing with two-factor authentication alone is enough of a headache that I would recommend this. And finally, Google has a larger cybersecurity budget than you. I don't know who's in the talk, but I'm pretty sure that when you're publishing stories about spending $10 billion on a national level, it's tough to compete. But on a more practical level, the big sites tend to rely on new accounts being verified with something like another account or relying on a phone call. And that kind of two-factor registration means that it's less likely that you're going to get the casual scammer coming in, generating a new email on 10-minute mail, and doing some unauthorized bug testing on your application. But as good software engineers, we shouldn't blindly implement things without having an understanding of how they work. So let's take a look under the hood of these processes, define a little vocabulary, and walk through what happens when you click on that user-friendly button. The main two players in this space are Security Assertion Markup Language, or SAML, and OpenID Connect, or OIDC. There's a handful of differences, but they're broadly surface level, using JSON versus XML, a few extra steps for authentication or security. Really, you should keep in mind that these are both just communication standards. They can be made to work very similarly depending on how they're implemented. And they'll follow a very similar track once we're demonstrating this later. But they unfortunately use different vocabulary for the same groups. I'm going to go ahead and use SAML terminology because it's what I'm more familiar with, and because I think that the service provider can be defined as the one providing the service. You'll also hear them called the relying party or the client. Meanwhile, the identity provider provides the identity for the user. You might also see them called the authorization server or the resource server in other contexts. So you want to get the user logged in, you want to get them an ID token, and optionally, in OIDC flow, you'll want to get them an authorization code. This part can definitely trip up people who aren't familiar with the process. Don't worry, we'll call it out later. We're going to walk through the OIDC login flow because it's what's used by these social login buttons, but keep in mind when we talk a bit about SAML, they are really similar. I want to stress that. So, as a developer who wants to get this going, your first steps are going to be registering with the identity provider of choice. I'm going with Google because they're one of the big ones, but it's going to look similar regardless on who you pick. Your first step is going to be getting a client ID to identify your application to the identity provider, and a client secret that only you know to verify that requests are coming from you. You're going to set up your consent screen, should be fairly straightforward. And finally, you'll have to figure out what to do with the information token that you get back from them. Revisiting that example, once again, stretch your imagination, pretend that I'm John, logging in with Google this time. The website does not have my Google credentials. It shouldn't. That would be a problem. So it tells me that, and it gives me a redirect response. I try and log in, and it tells me to go to Google. It gives me a redirect URL to bring the credentials back, and a handful of other handshake variables that are a bit out of scope for this talk. So I'm redirected. Now I go to Google. I say that I'd like to log into this website, and I'd give them the redirect URL for that website, pass along whatever handshake variables were necessary, maybe the client ID to specifically call out that website. And from there, any number of back and forths can happen. Things like logging in, maybe I'm already authenticated and just have to click forward. Maybe I want to reset my password. But crucially, as the website, you don't have to care about any of this. You just have to wait for the end result when the identity provider confirms my identity and provides a code and tells me to redirect back to the original website. So once again, I go to the website, this time with the code, and I ask to be let in. But from the website's perspective, I've just shown up to a URL, a publicly known URL at that, and provided a code. They might want a bit extra security. And so in a step, they go directly to the identity provider. They provide that code that I handed them, identify themselves somehow, and ask, hey, does this code actually belong to John? And because they just provided the code, they've signed it, they've shown that it belongs to them, was made by them. The identity provider says, yes, that's John. And here's his info, which you should be able to have. He's consented to give you. And from there, the website can take that info, turn it into, verify it in any other ways that they need to, cross-reference it with their own database, and finally generate a custom token to pass on to me. And from there, it's just business as usual. I have a bearer token, and I use it whenever I need to show that I am who I say I am. And great news, that's about as complicated as it gets. There might be other steps for verification, optional steps where the website talks to the identity provider to get a little bit more information, but generally, it's going to look something like this. For a SAML flow, if the service provider initiates it, it'll look very similar, except for it'll skip that last step. The user will just directly get the identity token. Still very secure. And if you interact with an enterprise dashboard, you're doing something called IDP, initiated single sign-on. The enterprise dashboard knows where the URL for the website is, so it can just directly route you there with the credentials in hand. And all of that complexity to the end user just looks like clicking on a button a couple of times. And it really shows the power of entry-level single sign-on. But let's get a little bit more advanced, move up the ranks a little, talk about business-to-business spaces. Here you're going to be looking at integrating SAML into what you do and expanding your market. As an example, at HENNGE, we get company-provided access to Udemy. It's a great deal for all parties, lets us do some self-study on our own, encourages us to broaden ourselves. But it does encourage the question of how employees generally should log in. On Udemy's login page, there's Facebook and Apple, which is a little bit creepy if my company asked me to provide that info. I could connect with Google, provided my company already used Google as its email service. Or I could use my own private email and password and somehow tie it to the company, thereby exposing a lot of personal information and also dealing with the password woes from earlier. But central to all of these, and most concerningly as a business, There's no way to easily add people on when they become employees or easily remove people when they move on from the company. To be explicit, if your application can't solve that problem, it will not get enterprise customers. This is one of the things that they will look for, and it's a very important thing from their perspective. Sure, for Udemy, they might be out a little bit of money if a former employee can access it on their own, but you can enter serious compliance or legal issues if a former employee can access something they shouldn't. Luckily, Udemy tells us exactly how we should log into their site as employees, and it's to configure a custom SSO connection with SAML 2.0. And as a developer, you might want to start working towards a bit of a mindset change here. Those social logins from earlier are great at adding individual users to your system, but you're not adding individuals anymore. You're adding groups of users, and you have to care about what defines that group. In the company case, what defines an employee? Is it just having that custom domain email? And of course, what do you do with a former employee? In the business to consumer space, having a user that doesn't really interact with your product is fine. Takes up a little space on the database. Or even better, their payment is still hooked up and they're paying for a Netflix subscription that they have forgotten the password for. But that's no longer the case here. You have to be able to get people out of your system as easily as you get them in. So, why SAML? Among other reasons, it's time tested. In the enterprise space, that reliability and showing that it's gone through the ringer in terms of bug fixes is a lot more comforting to big players. It happens to play well with typical employee directory structures, and it's easier to establish security groups based on the individual tenant. But more than any of these, it's just done this way because it's done this way. If you're an identity provider, you'll support SAML and look for service providers that support SAML. And if you'd like to connect to enterprise services with your application, you will provide SAML so that you can work with the identity providers. And it's a cycle that's, frankly, we're not going to break here. It's better to just work within it and provide the service through SAML 2.0. So, as you're gearing up to expand your app, you are going to have to make some decisions and refactor a few things to make it work. But you aren't going to have to do too terribly much. You're going to have to manage info from the various identity providers you work with. You're going to have to manage certificates, redirect URLs, come up with ways to dynamically select these things, and securely store them. And of course, you are going to need to figure out how to route your logging in users where they need to go. You are also going to have to start to consider separating groups of users more strongly, making sure that users from one tenant cannot access data on another becomes very, very important when certain legal ramifications come into play. Typically, this is done by making subdomains for all the individual enterprises you work with. For example, we log in at henge.udemy.com. And of course, one of the bigger changes is that you are now working with groups that have IT departments. You should not be fielding individual user complaints at the enterprise level. You have admins to do that for you. And you will have to figure out how to safely let them interact with service provider and identity provider configs, especially considering the case where they mess up the configs and can no longer use single sign-on, so they have to use a password backup. And of course, the admins of these services should be able to change things like billing, but realistically, users should not. But looking at this set of requirements, you're looking at adding different levels of users, separating people by which tenant they belong to, dealing with access management and a custom URL. These are things that you should be thinking about anyway when you're trying to get business customers. And as to whether it's worthwhile, once again, looking at Udemy is a great option here. On the individual side, it's $30 a month per month, and you can stop at any time. But if you can capture that enterprise business, you're looking at adding 5 users to 20 users at a time for the sum of the whole year, including a Talk to Us button if you'd like to add more than 20 users at a time. It's great for the business, it's great for the application, and it can work with your application as well. So we're about at the end of the talk, and the question is, what should come next for you? Ideally, integrating social logins into your site if it's on the business to consumer space. Starting to look into making those SAML decisions for enterprise customers. And if you are a business that's looking to manage its users, deal with those password woes I was talking about earlier, I happen to know a pretty good identity provider that you could look into to manage those things. Or maybe you've really jived with the talk and it's really spoken to you. You might consider going into the field yourself. If you care about data, routing it where it needs to go. If you think that information security is an interesting, worthwhile topic, and crucially, if you think that collaboration is one of the key steps in a better internet, you might look into figuring out how to do SSO as a career. And of course, this field might be for you if making the easiest option and the best option one and the same is something you're passionate about. Remember, if the problem is too many buttons, you can tape over them and lead to a better user experience. I really hope that I've shown you a bit of how these better outcomes can happen when we trust each other. And thank you so much for your time. Happy to take questions from here.
Woo! Let's give it up for Jon Gaul. Thank you so much, Jon, for the presentation. How do you feel?
Oh, fantastic.
Great.
That was such a joy.
Did you see that there's so many questions coming up for you?
No, not at all. I've been
lot.
focusing on the presentation.
Like a lot. Okay, so let's go through the questions now. I would like to invite you to join me here.
Oh, thank you so much.
So, right, thank you so much, everyone, for the questions. We saw a lot of questions popping up here and there. So, first question, Jon, pineapple pizza, yes or no?
Oh, I see you're going with a really you're going with a hard question early, and I'm gonna make enemies here. I think yes to pineapple, no to ham.
Correct. Yay! I like pineapple pizza, so I like it.
Well, downhill from here.
I'm just saying. All right. So we have a number of questions asked by a lot of people, and we're just gonna go through it one by one, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Great. So the first question from Anonymous: do I have to choose between OIDC and SAML, or can I do both? What do you think?
That's an excellent question. You are going to have to pick one in terms of what flow you are going down at any given time. I think you would really be writing some gnarly code if you tried to make a single path that handled both options. However, in a website, there's nothing stopping you from implementing both and winding up getting that token from the user the same way. That last step is building an access token that works within your system. So it doesn't really matter if it comes from an identity provider that uses SAML or one that uses OIDC. Of course, saying do the option that gives you more work might not be the most popular, but it's certainly there if you want.
Great. So hopefully that answered your question, anonymous person. So that was Jon's answer to that, and we will go to the second question from Subasa. Usually SAML is gated behind expensive plans on SaaS. Is implementing SAML expensive?
Interesting question. Thank you for it. Getting into the billing aspect is really one of the challenges here. It's marketed as being more expensive, not necessarily because it's more difficult to set up, but usually because it comes with larger groups that take more effort to manage and where the stakes are a little bit higher to manage them. Keeping an individual user happy is one thing, but keeping a whole enterprise that expects top quality service happy, that can be a little bit more challenging. On the development side, though, it's about as expensive to set up as any other thing. You might have to pay more for some certificate management, but given where on-demand software is, shouldn't be particularly difficult.
I see. So hopefully that answered your question too, Subasa. And we have 9 questions in total.
Cool,
But
I'll have another drink if you don't mind.
please, you had a long talk, so you might want to have some sip of drinks. So, right, the next question will be, it's also from Anonymous. How do I get extra information about the user?
Ooh, thank you, Anonymous. This is a very cool topic that we unfortunately didn't have time to get in deep for. But OIDC actually arose from a different communication standard known as OAuth 2.0. Previously, that was used to get more information about the user from the identity provider. So for instance, if you gave an app permission to use your Google contacts, you wouldn't want to give them the keys to the castle, so to speak, but you would want a way to say, yes, they can see my contacts and nothing else. So if you want to look into OAuth 2.0, it's a very similar flow to logging in. Ultimately, it sprung off and made OIDC because people were using it to log in and hacking it together to do that a whole bunch of different ways, which were not necessarily the best or the most secure. And so the standard of OIDC came about as a result. But still very much usable, still a big part of the online ecosystem, and a crucial way in making sure that not every minor startup app you work with has control of your entire email system.
I see. So yeah, that was the answer to the previous question from Anonymous. How
Thank
do I
you,
get
Anonymous.
extra information about the user? Just a reminder for all other audience, just in case you have questions, feel free to submit the question through the Q&A feature, because that's how we can see the question in a very efficient way. And yeah, also another question from Anonymous. So
Very busy guy, this
very
Anonymous.
busy person, this, yeah. What's the difference between OIDC and OAuth?
And OL?
OAuth.
Oh, yeah. So, as I mentioned, kind of stole the answer in the previous question, Anonymous. OIDC is purely for logging in. All it does is says that the identity provider confirms that, yep, this user is who they say they are. Meanwhile, OAuth 2.0 can add a really wide variety of read-only or, frankly, write-only permissions for various apps across various services. It is a little bit more complicated, and there's a lot more to configure. But it can definitely solve certain issues that something like single sign-on can't, making that access control on a little bit deeper of a level.
Great. So hope that answers your question, anonymous person. I don't know. We don't know if it's the same person or not, but it's already answered now. And apparently we have the last question, but I think, oh, okay. So there's 2 more questions, I guess.
Ah, perfect.
Right. And the first question is, not the first, like one of the questions is, doesn't SSO still rely on a password to log in to the identity provider? How do you keep that secure?
Ooh, interesting question. Because it does rely on a password, and that password has to be stored somewhere. One of the criticisms I've actually seen while researching this is that you are putting all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak. If someone can crack that one password, you're allowing them pretty much everywhere. It'd be like if your email got hacked and suddenly everyone can reset the passwords across your across every website you've used. For here, honestly, we're getting into this system where 2-factor authentication becomes really indispensable. Having something that sends you a text message that you then have to input in order to log in, sends you an email that you have to get, specialized applications, HENNGE Lock or Authenticator, or a physical piece of hardware that you have to plug into your computer to verify that you have the password and also you have this device. Things like that are really instrumental in increasing the security of that password. And side note, HENNGE does allow for these added security features. Look, I'm doing HENNGE Talks. I have to plug us a little.
It's not some other company talk, right? It's HENNGE Talk. Great.
Exactly.
Great. All right. So next question, also from Anonymous. I have an SPA or single page app with no backend server. Can I still do SAML?
Fantastic question. You can still do SAML authentication. In fact, you can do SAML authentication based off of what happens on the front end, or typically though, in single page apps, you more often see OIDC with something called, what is the acronym? PIXI, proof key that gets really into the weeds of what cryptography allows for, but essentially allows you to perform that last step of verification where the two backends directly talk to each other, but exclusively through the front end. In terms of SAML SAML alone through the front end, I would have to double check that it works natively, but I'll give it I'll look into it after that. And I believe there are ways that the audience can get in touch with us after this talk series if they have more questions.
You can connect with us on our LinkedIn page. You can leave a comment there, or you can just send an email to our team. We use the recruit@henge.com email address, but feel free to shoot us your question if you have any follow-up questions about the session. That'd be really great. Great. So it appears that we have the very last question of the session here. So
it's sad to see it go. This has been a lot of fun, actually.
Exactly, yeah. So this is from Tanjin Choden. The question is, I am new to SSO. Can you maybe talk about what factors other than cost to keep in mind while selecting the company that provides SSO, since there are many in the market?
Absolutely. From the context of this question, I assume that user, you are new to integrating SSO as a, well, I guess I can answer it for all these outcomes. If you're a company looking to make it possible for your employees to log in using single sign-on, cost definitely is one of the big concerns. And I am not particularly familiar with this. This is more into the business side of the company, but looking to make sure that the scale is right for you, that sometimes various businesses charge more or less depending on the number of users. You'll want to look into making sure that they provide the kinds of features you want. I mentioned two-factor authentication, that's a good one. Things that like admin tools that let you more granularly manage your employees, that'll also come in. Reliability, making sure that they do the things that you want to be able to do. Going through a day in your life or the life of your employees and trying to see how the features that they offer can benefit those day-to-day operations will probably be the best. If you are a developer looking to get more into single sign-on and looking beyond partnering with individual identity providers, at the social login level, certainly there's no cost to consider because Google, Facebook, Twitter, they all want you to use their product to log in your users because it gets them more users as well, brings them further into their ecosystem as well as yours. Some of them, though, will be more or less willing to share things like their username, show you their profile picture that you can integrate, and looking into what additional information you would get can help make decisions there. Other than that, if you're new to single sign-on, the more research you do, the more you can really get a feel for what's actually happening. I think the more informed you're going to be on making these decisions. Certainly making this talk got me way more familiar with single sign-on despite working for a company that handles single sign-on as a business. It's a wide world and there's lots of different opinions, so I think taking in the more of them will get you better results. Fantastic question, though. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanjin Choden, for the question. So maybe we can wrap it up for this session. So maybe, John, if there's any key takeaways that you would like to share with everyone about SSO in general, because in this session we're covering about the guide, about working with SSO, foundational understanding, the real-world product knowledge, and also, is this for you, the field of SSO? If you are aspiring to be like software engineers that is working on SSO field.
Absolutely. It's a very broad talk, and it's a broad field in general, as I just said. And I certainly get that there's a lot to look into. a concise summary might be hard, but whatever your application is trying to do, single sign-on can probably make it do that more efficiently and smoother for the end user. If you're looking to get into the field, you certainly don't have to come in as an expert. I've learned a lot on the job, and I've learned a lot making this presentation. And the community is full of passionate people who want to share that information with you. And if I could give any one takeaway, I'm struggling to think of another one, then please use a password manager. It'll save you so much time and effort.
It's really important. Don't use your birthday. Don't use your birthday.
Password 01 is done. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is not a safe password.
Exactly. All right, so I think that wraps up the session. Thank you so much, Jon, for the amazing presentation. Thank you so much, and maybe.
Thank you, Tech Crew, and thank you, Jazz, as well.
Thank you. My pleasure. Pleasure is mine. So maybe if you can go to the next slide, it would be really, really appreciated if you could let us know how do we go with the session. So you could scan the QR code from your screen and help us to fill in the post-event survey. It's just like, it's not going to be like long. It's not going to be like longer than 5 minutes. So it's going to be really, really brief. Also, maybe if you could, I don't know, like we would like to know where are you watching HENNGE Talks from. So if you could like type in the chat box, tell us like where are you watching this show from. That would be really, really great. We just want to know where the audience are from. And coming up next, if you can go to the next slide, please. We have the second session of the day, which is Next Gen Company Culture, where we will have a deep dive on a day in the life of a full-time software engineer at a B2B SaaS company. And that's it from us. I'm Jazz, and this is Jon. Thank you so much for attending the first session of HENNGE Talks, and see you in the second session of the day. Bye.